Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. On today's episode, we're talking about child soldiering. That is, young people under the age of 18 who are members of armed forces or armed militias. We've heard a lot about militias in the context of the recent news out of Iraq and Iran and ISIS. The idea that there are many, many tens of thousands of young people serving in armed groups of one form or another in many parts of the Mideast, in the Yemen conflict, and also in armed conflicts in Africa and more. You'd be surprised to know that the demographic that is most active in enlisting in the U.S. armed forces are those who are under the age of 18, 17-year-olds in particular. So it is a really important and fascinating conversation with wide-ranging implications. My guest on the episode today, Mark Drumbl, is a law professor at Washington and Lee University who has studied this issue for the last couple of decades and walks us through the complexities of this problem in some ways that you might find surprising and challenging to the way we are used to thinking about soldiers in armed conflict, but in ways that I know will be thought-provoking and really very interesting to you. So stay tuned for this episode of Good Law, Bad Law. On today's episode, we're talking about child soldiers. I was talking with my stepdaughter about this as I picked her up from school today, and I'll get to that in a second. But first, let me introduce my guest, Mark Drumbl. Mark is a law professor at Washington and Lee University and the co-author of a new handbook on child soldiers, which he's going to tell us about. First of all, Mark, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law.
Thank you for the opportunity, and I'm delighted to be here.
I was, as I mentioned, I was just picked my stepdaughter up from school today. She's 15, and she was telling me that there are memes going around her age group. You know, things like fashion 2019 compared to fashion 2020, and the images for fashion 2020 show young people in military attire. This obviously inspired by the news in the last several days of the killing of a major Iranian general and terrorist leader, and how we're watching hour by hour as the repercussions of that airstrike are being talked about and being felt throughout the Middle East. But it's not. I said to her, that's one of those funny, not funny things. It's not funny at all. And that's really getting us at the topic of your work and the topic of this book, which looks at the problem of what you characterize as something on the order of 250,000 to 300,000 children worldwide who are associated with armed forces or armed groups of one kind or another, many of them in countries in Africa and the Middle East, but not limited to those parts of the world either. So maybe you could start, Mark, by giving us a little background on yourself and how you became interested in this issue, and what the book seeks to bring together in terms of both people and the issues relating to this topic. And then we'll get into some of the specifics of the issue as well.
Absolutely. I'm very glad to relate how I became interested in the topic of child soldiers. It's actually been for a couple of decades now. I'm a law professor, as you mentioned in your introduction, and I work in the area of international criminal law. So I'm trained as a lawyer and I teach law and I'm schooled in law, so to speak. And about 20 years ago, I had an opportunity to work in the prisons in Rwanda, several years after the Rwandan genocide, and I
Mm-hmm.
worked there as a public defender. And in that particular capacity, I represented individuals who were accused of genocide and crimes against humanity. I mean, represented is a more of a metaphor for actually just ensuring that people had some connection to charges and some connection to files, but that was obviously an important part of the process. And in that capacity, I had about 250 clients, a slice of whom were minors, persons under the age of 18. And it struck me that the role of children in the Rwandan genocide was quite ubiquitous and also quite under-discussed. Children served as perpetrators of genocide. Children were horribly victimized during the genocide, both adolescents and prepubescent kids, but also infants and toddlers. And children, persons under the age of 18, also served as liberators and served in armed forces that ended the genocide. So,
Okay.
at a very early entry point for me in the world of international criminal law, I sort of became confronted and confounded with the reality that persons under the age of 18, children, are touched and touch others in multiple ways when it comes to mass atrocity. So I became quite curious and interested and invested in this particular angle. And then several years after that, I wrote a book called Reimagining Child Soldiers, which offered sort of theoretical frame in law about how to think about the child soldier as an actor, not only as a subject or object of law, but as both an entity that required law's assistance, but also uh, required a level of reciprocity in terms of taking responsibility. And then to bookend this conversation and close out your question, just this past year, I participated in quite a large project, as you mentioned, compiling an edited collection with over 30 contributors that looked at child soldiering from an interdisciplinary angle to bring in anthropologists and economists and practitioners and literary theorists and activists to think about how child soldiering could be understood and conceptualized and then also deterred and redressed. So this was quite an exciting journey for me and my co-editor, who's also a lawyer in the UK, and it brings us to a place in which we can have this conversation.
Well, and I have so many questions now about this that come immediately to mind. I think maybe for starters, it's helpful to get some definitions on the table, and so we know what we're really talking about here. First of all, what is a child? You at one point in the introduction mentioned some famous children from history who have in our historical imagination an association with military involvement, people like Joan of Arc, for example. But we're talking, obviously about warfare and armed conflict in the modern sense of that, which has changed dramatically from the days when children were used as, again, to mention one that you cite, when they were used as drummer boys or flag carriers in situations where armies were meeting on a battlefield somewhere. So, I mean, what is a child as you're using that term uh, in talking about the problem of child soldiers in different conflicts around the world?
Sure. So that's a great starting point. And I think what I'd like to do is take your question and respond to it through three different steps. So
Mm.
first, definition. secondly, direction, and then thirdly, what I would loosely call limitation. So let's start off with the definition. So the currently accepted definitional framework of a child soldier is both chronological in nature as well as sort of conduct related. Chronologically, a child is understood as any person under the age of 18, and that maps the notion of the child in soldiering to the notion of the child in broader human rights law, such as the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, that sets 18 as a transitional benchmark from childhood into adulthood. Then there's the conduct aspect. So, what does it mean to soldier? And the definition of soldiering, the conduct aspect, is actually quite broad. So child soldiers include persons under the age of 18 who do much more than just carry weapons or serve as combatants. The definition of soldiering is quite capacious and is quite broad and includes everything from being a spy, sentry, saboteur, cook, cleaner, uh, sex slave, forced conjugal partner, um, someone involved in auxiliary roles.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality of the demographics is that the majority of child soldiers do not routinely carry weapons, nor do they routinely participate in combatancy. They tend to serve auxiliary functions and often face a greater threat from their own side than from the other side, in particular, children who serve in forced conjugal relationships or are sex slaves, for example. And on the definitional front, just to round that out, the term child soldier is actually no longer in vogue. The actual phraseology now is children associated with armed groups
Mm-hmm.
or armed forces. But that's a bit of it's a bit tongue tying and tongue twisting, and it's a bit of a long phraseology. So the term child soldiering is still sometimes used as um, a proxy
Mm-hmm.
for this longer children associated with armed forces or armed groups. But the definition is as I've set it out. Let me say a quick word about direction.
Okay.
Um, you pointed out a historical reality that children have been enmeshed in military conflict for a very, very long time, going back to the Spartans, going back to well before, the classic era. And one thing that has happened over the past sort of generation, I would say, since the 1990s, is that child soldiering has begun to become seen as a matter of law rather than a question of military ethics. So, throughout history, yes, children have participated in armed conflict. And the question whether or not they should participate was left to the realm of ethics. Children often became involved when times were desperate and forces were very thin. For example, the Battle of New Market in the American Civil War, where the Confederate cadets became involved because there were just so few um, forces at that juncture.
Mm-hmm.
And what has happened over time is that child soldiering has moved from ethics to law such that the deployment of children in conflict is flatly seen as illegal. And with that has come, I think, a perception of child soldiers as decimated, destroyed, constantly negatively affected by armed conflict, as um, really damaged. And yes, war is terrible on young people, but the fact remains that historically, many times that children have been involved in conflict, they have actually been seen as heroes. They have been seen as putting in place their political will, putting in place their understanding of how to build a better world. Um, there's been a lot of chat recently about persons under the age of 18 who volunteered and often lied to fight with the Allies in World
Hmm.
War One, for example.
Right.
And these young people are not seen as desperate. They're actually seen with a level of martial pride. And I'm not saying that we should go back to a time where children should be involved in conflict. Quite the opposite. I'd like to deter this. However, what I am saying is that in my experiences, in terms of how one speaks with a child soldier afterwards, after conflict, as part of rehabilitation, very important to recognize that child soldier as a human being to be spoken to with respect, not only with pity, not only with condescension, not only with a level of know it allism, but to respect and understand that that child is a person. And there are many young people who actually have many reasons why they end up in fighting forces. And those should be listened to and not spoken over.
Well, and even in what you've covered so far, Mark, it seems to me it's very, uh, you have a great variety in understanding who are these young people we're talking about. I mean, there's a big difference between, uh, a teenage king from medieval times, or even young Americans who uh, were eager to enlist during World War One or World War Two, say, and some of the images we might think of, particularly when we hear some of the countries where the problem is is the greatest, um, countries like Iraq or ISIS fighters, or some of the countries in turmoil in Africa. There's a big difference. So, how much of what we're talking about, we talk about 250,000 or so young people involved in some aspect of child soldiering, which, as you defined it, covers quite a range of conduct, from carrying a weapon to forced labor, or sex trafficking and so forth. How much are we talking about children who are victims in the sense that they are forced into these positions, versus children who, like some of the other examples we've mentioned, um, have enough consciousness of will that we could say they're volunteering for this?
Okay, so this is a great question in that it sort of addresses the third sort of angle that I wanted to get to in our prior exchange, namely limitations of the current definition. And
Okay.
limitations are both under-inclusive and over-inclusive. So let me talk about under-inclusiveness first. Um, the figure of about 250,000 children worldwide reflects those that would currently sort of be in states of militarization. And those hotspots shift through time. Historically, if you go back to the 1990s, when child soldiering first came on the agenda, the child soldier was largely seen as a young African boy. And that reflects the reality that at that time, the most visible imagery of child soldiering were very young African boys. This neglected the fact that at that time, roughly 40% of child soldiers worldwide were girls. Then, with the advent of a resolution of some conflicts in Africa and a spreading of conflicts more in the Middle East, the demographics of child soldiering shifted such that today the most volatile areas where children become enmeshed militarily are in fact in the Middle East,
Hmm.
Iran, Iraq, Yemen. Um, so there's been a bit of a shift. And of course, an additional wrinkle to the shift to children in terrorist contexts is the reality that there are quite a number of children that have left Western societies, including the United States, Canada, the UK, Australia, France, the Netherlands, and have emigrated into Iraq and ISIS-controlled territory to fight on behalf of ISIS. And that's sort of another dimension. Now, I say that the figure is limited because, as I understand child soldiering, it is not only those children who are currently militarized that should be part of the conversational space. Children who formerly were militarized, who are seeking to become rehabilitated and reintegrated, also should count as within those numbers. And the figure that we mentioned earlier does not include those particular children. One cannot cease
what is the
being a
scope of
child.
that thing? Because I mean,
Hundreds of thousands of
wow.
children.
Okay.
All right. So that is a very important dynamic to recognize, because one does not cease being a child soldier just when one is demobilized and disarmed. One also has to be reintegrated and rehabilitated. And those two aspects are the trickiest part of the phenomenon. Now, let me add another very important limitation to the conversation on child soldiering. You'll remember from the original definition that a child soldier is defined by membership in an armed group or an armed force. Now, armed forces are the national armies of states. And armed groups are the armed elements of rebel groups, factions that may fight the states, non-state actors, Al-Qaeda, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in both cases, what armed groups and armed forces share in common is the capacity to engage in armed conflict, the capacity to engage in war. Now, one very disturbing phenomenon is that there are many groups out there that look like armed groups, but are more criminal groups and criminal syndicates than they necessarily are armed groups, because they don't necessarily have a mission or a capacity to wage armed conflict. I'm thinking of criminal syndicates, drug cartels, gangs. And a very important topic of conversation is the reality that the recruitment practices of criminal gangs, criminal syndicates, extremist groups is very similar when it comes to children than the recruitment strategies of armed groups. And yet, we speak far too little about young people in criminal gangs and criminal groups, when I think we actually have a great deal to learn about their reasons for joining, the things they do, and their paths to exit and rehabilitation and reintegration. We have a great deal to learn for children in criminal groups from the experiences of children in armed groups. And this is something that I think is utterly salient even for conversations about policing and law and criminal justice in the United States. So that, to me, is another limitation, that there's just all the research is cabined towards armed groups. And as you know, there's a lot of kids over the world that are in criminal groups and
Mm-hmm.
criminal syndicates. So I think there's a huge crossover that we need to learn. And then a final point. You are correct that the international activist definition of child soldiering covers everyone from 17-year-old recruits in the United States Armed Forces straight through to a 12-year-old sex slave in the Lord's Resistance Army in northern Uganda, or in ISIS, for example. And as you know, you're a lawyer, you know that law is defined by its categories, and categories often tend to include too much and exclude too little, or vice
Mm-hmm.
versa. And clearly, that is a dimension here that I think requires further interrogation. And one of the major points that I try to get across in my work is that it's very important for us to dig deep and think of children in armed groups and armed forces as individuals and not only as group members, to individualize the conversations that we have with them and the way in which we listen to them. And I think if we have a more pluralistic understanding, we'll do better respecting their humanity and also disengaging them from these situations. But Aaron, you would also be perhaps surprised to learn that in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in Germany, in recent years, the fastest growing percentage segment of volunteer recruits into the armed forces of those three countries is actually persons under the age of 18. In the UK, recruitment can begin at 16, like it can in Canada. In the US and Germany, it's at 17. But if you look at the demographics in recent years, there is an acceleration in the recruitment in these highly developed, highly sophisticated armed forces of persons under the age of 18. And on the gender front, just recently seen some data from Germany, and it's similar in the United States. The recruitment, the volunteer recruitment of young women under the age of 18 in national armed forces is right now at its highest points ever. So this is, I think when we need to think about child soldiering, on the one hand, we need to look past these particularly invidious horror stories that had come out of Africa and the Middle East to recognize the globality of the phenomenon. But then we also need to look down in the details and recognize the individual motivations at hand.
Well, Mark, you are right. I am really surprised to learn that. And so I guess that raises a next level of questions, which is once we appreciate the challenges in arriving at any kind of accepted definitions in these areas, what is the agenda? And you mentioned that this is a matter of law, and you are a lawyer and a law professor, but it's also a great concern to people who come at this issue from a lot of other disciplines. And by the way, this is a big issue, even more broadly speaking, looking at criminal justice generally. I mean, there's questions about incarceration of young people, finding of liability of young people, and how those individuals may be treated differently, or in some cases unconstitutionally, depending on the circumstances. So there are real challenges in terms of what to do and how we respond to these situations. So what does that mean then in terms of an agenda for people such as yourself who focus on this issue?
Mm.
What,
So I think,
yeah.
I think the most important step is not a plan or a policy or a program or paragraphs. I think the most important step is a reimagination of how we speak to young people. And what I mean by that is, when it comes to child soldiering, there is a very well intentioned transnational community of activists who have been successful in identifying the problem, disseminating it to a global audience. But there has been lower levels of success when it comes to ending the practice and reintegrating child soldiers. And to me, the major gap that arises is that the discourse on ending child soldiering has not been effectively communicated or connected to a broader conversation about empowering juvenile rights. So, for example, in international human rights law, juveniles and young people are given certain rights over reproductive autonomy, rights to have a say in the medical treatment they receive. There's conversations about freedom of association, conversation about political rights, even rights to vote in some places for persons under the age of 18. But the same activists that push for that deny that any child ever can have the freedom of association to willingly join a military force or a fighting force. So children's involvement in war is seen entirely as a negation of their free will. That is impossible in the eyes of many activists that a young person could in any way exercise any agency or free will in becoming politically or militarily involved. And that conflicts not only with a broader discourse of juvenile rights and empowerment, it also conflicts with the data, because the data suggests that roughly 2/3 of all children worldwide who are child soldiers exercise a certain level of volunteerism in coming forward and enlisting. Only approximately 1/3 of all child soldiers globally become child soldiers through abduction or conscription or by being born in armed forces in a long-standing conflict. And youth volunteerism is by far the most under-discussed, underappreciated aspect of the child soldiering phenomenon. And that's because adult activists are uncomfortable with it, because it stands at cross purposes with the idea that these children are all faultless passive victims.
Right.
Our language is too crude in this particular regard. So to come full circle, what I would argue is the first step is not to infantilize 17 and 16-year-olds. The vast majority of child soldiers worldwide are between the ages of 15 and 17. The imagery that one sees of the 8-year-old with, socks falling down and barely able to carry a weapon. Yes, there are 8-year-olds, but it is a tiny, tiny percentage. Tiny percentage. I'm not saying it's a tragedy. It's not a tragedy. It is
Sure.
a tragedy,
Sure.
but it's a tiny percentage. So the representational imagery of child soldiers leverages the most extreme cases into a universal picture, which belies the reality that your typical child soldier is 16 years old and came forward to enlist. And until we become comfortable with that, we are not going to effectively be able to dialogue about this particular problem and improve situations. And in fact, one thing that I have noticed in my field work is that many countries in which child soldiering first emerged were deeply gerontocratic. In other words, were deeply run by older generations, and younger generations were very disempowered. And after conflict, notwithstanding all our conversation about child soldiering, those age-driven hierarchies still persisted. And up and until we conceptualize juveniles as both rights bearers and persons that have obligations to others, and we only see militarized young people as faultless, helpless, dilapidated victims, we're not really going to advance the conversation. And there's another very important point that I've encountered in my field work, and that is the following. Child soldiers can really hurt other people in times of armed conflict. They kill, they rape, and they torture. They commit acts of violence.
Mm-hmm.
Not most child soldiers, but there are child soldiers who do that. And the people that they hurt also are entitled to justice. Many of those people themselves are also children, and many are adults. And one thing that I have found in my work is that there is no lonelier place to be. There's no lonelier place to be in a post-conflict zone than when you talk about, so Aaron, you talk about a loved one of yours that has been killed, or you talk about yourself and you've been hurt, mutilated. And it was, let's say, a 13-year-old who did it. Aaron, there is no lonelier place than when you talk about the pain that you suffered and the losses that you experienced. And then when you talk about who did it, and when the person who did it is 13-year-old boy or girl, and then when me, the person asking you about what happened to you during conflict, and you tell your story about your pain, and then you tell your story about who did it, there is no lonelier place for you than when I then look at you and I say, Aaron, you know that 13-year-old had no idea what he was doing, no say, no input. And Aaron, that 13-year-old is the real victim here. Mm-hmm. There is no lonelier place to be told that when you have suffered a harm, your harm is erased by the nature of the perpetrator. And until we come to terms with that, we are not fully going to advance in terms of reconciliation. In Sierra Leone, for example, and other African jurisdictions where child soldiers did commit terrible acts of violence, often under the form of forced ingestion of drugs, obviously, but pain is still pain. When they were released into their home communities, international activists came into those villages and told the public in those villages that all the children are innocent, they didn't know what they were doing. The community needed to be, quote, sensitized to re-accept children who had committed this level of violence. And there was something incredibly paternalistic and almost imperialist about a bunch of activists from New York and London and Geneva and The Hague going into conflict-riven villages and tutoring people about how they should feel in the promotion of an international agenda to protect children that, however well-intentioned, was too simplistic and too reductive to map onto the complexities of how persons in the community actually felt. This is the kind of stuff we need to be reimagining.
All right, so let me see if I don't have the answer, but let me see if I understand something about what you're saying, the challenges here and how we imagine children in these roles. Because it seems to me we have had deep conflicts in the way we regard children in terms of wanting to protect them and at the same time giving them tremendous responsibilities. It seems like that conflict has existed for a long time in our own country. I mean, we have people too young to buy a drink in a bar, and now as the age for buying tobacco products goes up to 21 in many parts of the country, if not across the country at this point, not old enough to buy a pack of cigarettes, who are, even before I knew that there were high rates of 17-year-olds enlisting. I mean, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds. I mean, the image we have of our GIs in our greatest modern campaigns, we refer to them as our boys. Mm-hmm. You know, bring our boys home, not bring our men home, bring our boys home. So where are you then going with that? I mean, we recognize, the UN has recognized this, that there should be special rights accorded to children, human rights recognized for children. We do have, as we mentioned earlier, many aspects of our criminal law that deal with 15, 16, 17-year-olds as adults in criminal proceedings. So what are you saying as far as how to resolve those conflicts? Do we see child soldiers? Should we think of them less as victims and think of them more as equally responsible for their conduct, despite their age? Should we be working to try to eliminate or encourage countries and armed groups to eliminate child soldiering, or should we be looking in the other direction if we're now talking, as many are, about lowering the voting age in this country to 16? And there are some parts of the country, I think Baltimore, for example, that have been experimenting with that. Should we be looking to encourage 16 and 17-year-olds to enlist and thinking about that approvingly?
I think what we ought to be doing is paying less attention to absolute age-driven categories in our conversations.
Okay.
I think we should be considering age and maturity and evolving capacities as a factor in how we think about agency and autonomy and authorship. But I think we should be scaling back our absolute obsession with the Gregorian calendar and chronology.
Yeah.
That's what I think we should be doing. And I think that would map much more onto how a lot of people actually live their lives on a daily basis. So instead of thinking about chronological age, I wonder if we could think a little bit more about coming of age. So, for example, in many societies across the world, the idea of age is not measured in time, it's measured in experience. It's measured in what do you have to do at some point in your life in terms of the responsibilities that you need to exercise over your loved ones. And in many African conflicts, many children ended up enlisting in armed forces because they did so to protect their villages, they did so to protect their families, they did so because they were a senior among a world of juniors. And we need to, I think, conceptualize that messier and more complicated and more experiential notion of age instead of making so much hay out of a simple birthday, when in many parts of the world, the birthday is not determinative in the same fashion. I'm going to tell you something else. The protective scope of the law for persons under the age of 18 is coupled with a real heavy-handedness of law, in particular international law, that comes down after you've turned 18. So up until your 18th birthday, you're a child soldier. You can't be held responsible, so goes the activist thinking, for war crimes. But if you do them at the age of 18 and one day, the law will make limited to no acknowledgement of your youth because you've fallen on the other side.
Right. There's no
categorical binary.
Right. There's no focus on your emotional maturity.
Yeah.
Or what we know about neuroscience. Yeah.
And there's tons of data that suggests adolescent developmental neurobiology, neuroscience, that suggests that in many ways the consequences, action continuum, impulsivity, all of this continues until like the early 20s. But that's also going to be regionally and geographically differentiated. In many war-torn countries where child soldiering is at its sort of most representationally pronounced, the average age of half of the society may be under the age of 18, even under the age of 15. In Sierra Leone, at the height of the conflict, life expectancy for men was in the late 30s. So I think part of this, to me, is a broader turn towards greater flexibility, suppleness, and malleability in how we think about um, individuals involved in really tough situations. And the lawyer's instinct is not to do that because we like categories, we like flowcharts, we like organizational simplicities. And this is one thing that I've really learned from experts in other disciplines. Now, going back to the human rights advocacy angle, one thing we've got to understand is one of the reasons there is so much conversation about child soldiering is because human rights activists have been extremely productively successful in placing children's rights, particularly in violent contexts, onto a global discursive and fundraising agenda.
Mm.
And this is good because I think we can all agree that we don't want young people to be involved in war. And in the process of elevating very successfully child soldiering onto a global fundraising humanitarian platform, that process is assisted by very simple images of very young children with no input in what they're doing, being forced to do all of these things, because that is a more effective way of broadcasting a humanitarian catastrophe than the much more nuanced, complex realities of what actually happens. And to me, this is a simple byproduct of marketing. And it would be benign, but for the reality that the same simplistic impulses that essentialize child soldiering and get it on a global agenda where we are filled with empathy, that same impulse that succeeds in getting it out there as a problem fuels policy responses that are not successful.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem has a name, but the process of naming and shaming the problem is not redressing it because the policy tools are too simplistic. And to me, the major link is towards a juvenile right, juvenile independence, and a less categorical understanding of age and time and chronology.
Well, it seems like some of what we've talked about is less complex and less challenging than other aspects. For example, it's hard to imagine a young girl volunteering to become a sex slave. So some aspects of child soldiering seem more clear cut in terms of responsibility, autonomy, and so on.
Absolutely, but let me
Right.
I'm sorry for interrupting you, but that's
No,
a
please.
crucially important point, and let me jump in on that. Here's another problem with category. A child soldier is a person under the age of 18 associated with armed forces. That's the category.
Yeah.
What does that mean? That means the boy soldier with an AK-47 who commits endemic sexual violence is in the same category, the same legal category as the girl who has been abducted and has been forced to be a sex slave to 1, 2, 5 men.
Mm-hmm.
They're
Yeah.
both child soldiers.
Right.
And one of the advantages, I think, of getting away from categories is we can recognize the different experiences of the individuals within that particular category.
Yeah.
But for the purposes of the current status quo conversation, a child soldier is a child soldier as long as one is in that box, and all are victims.
So we have to look then, again, to pick up on your point, the issue of the chronological age is, as you're arguing, is far less important than the context, the conduct of the person involved, the culture in which they grew up. Even if it were possible, some greater understanding of their emotional and intellectual maturity. If we're going to think in terms of responsibility, but as a general proposition, as I think you also pointed out, it's hard to imagine, um, advocating for more children as members of armed groups. So, so how? And I guess we can try to end on this. I know you have an obligation in a few minutes, but given these complexities of definition and uh, what you're suggesting, that we look beyond bright lines based on age alone. How do you think people can uh, make recommendations, can
Right.
put pressure on those countries or those militia groups or whoever we're talking about, even our own country, to focus on the issue and things that should be done to minimize the role of children in armed conflict?
So I think there's really three issues going on with this. One is entry, the point of entry, and that's a future oriented. All right? What standards do we set for who is able to join an armed force or an armed group? And the second is exit and rehabilitation. What do we do for kids who
Okay.
are currently in and have recently come out? And what I'm saying is the kinds of policy mechanisms that you adopt upon entry do not have to be the same as the ones that you adopt for the kids that are in there now and who want to exit. And to me, the greatest need is for this more individualized treatment that accords less attention to chronological simplicity. That works best when it comes to children who are currently involved and want to exit or who've just exited. When it comes to the entry side, I guess one can have policies that root in a certain age and use age chronologically, but we're also not even sold on that particular idea yet because different countries have different minimum ages of recruitment. And
Mm-hmm.
there's another reality, which is that children often will not disclose their actual age when they are interested in joining an armed force.
Yeah.
So to me, the most important question is what do we do with the children who are currently in an armed group that is illegitimate in how it conducts itself? And what do we do for children who've been able to exit those
Yeah.
particular groups? Because there is also a well established link between poorly rehabilitated former child soldiers, even after conflict ends. There's a high rate of recidivism, not for them to join armed forces again once the conflict has ended, but to join criminal gangs
Yeah.
and engage in criminal delinquent behavior. And that
I,
is from many different nations.
I think that's a fantastic point. And I think you could apply that to the experience that many people who listen to this will be very familiar with, which is if we put aside bright line definitions of who is a child, and just think of those young men and women who have served in the U.S. Armed Forces in Afghanistan and Iraq, um, and the fight against ISIS as well. Many of those individuals, when they come home, face all kinds of problems, and I think most people agree we've done a pretty lousy job in this country of addressing those problems and taking care of those people. PTSD, moving towards drug abuse, suicide. I mean, there's a terrible problem with how we've treated veterans. Most of them young people,
Right.
right? So,
Well, and on
that,
that note,
yeah,
what I have found in my own field work is one of the major challenges that former child soldiers face. There's educational gaps. In some cases, there's obviously psychological trauma. But one of the simplest, um, uh, or the most immediate problems is conflict resolution. And what do I mean by that? I mean, in the context of an armed conflict, when there is a dispute with someone on your side or on the other side or with a third party, there's often an immediate recourse to violence in that particular space. But you can't do that in a civilian space, right? Because then
Mhm.
that's criminal conduct. And one of the most important things is to teach methods of conflict resolution in which words and deeds, instead of acts of violence, serve as a way in which to express your preferences and internalize the preferences of others. But you can't do that in a conflict resolution uh, space if after the conflict you've just schooled all the former child soldiers that they're always innocent and never did anything wrong
Right.
and nothing is ever their fault. Without some contrition or some admission of reciprocal obligation, it's very difficult to move forward. And that's sort of the point that I would try to get across. And as a final note, I mean, obviously you'll conclude your own show, but if I could get in one
Yeah.
last 10-second thing is, on this, I would caution against any simple solution, any 3-point program. What we need to do is change our entire mindset of how we think about persons under the age of 18 as living, breathing human beings. And I think this maps onto much broader conversations of juvenile rights and also intergenerational equality. And what I'm hopeful for is, as we begin to have more conversations about the future that we leave for our youngest generation, environmental concerns, technological concerns, automation concerns, that as part of this process, one thing that we can learn from shortcomings in our ability to deal with child soldiering is sometimes adults need to listen more
Mm.
and sit down instead of stand up and talk over.
Right.
That's my final point.
That is a
Thank you.
great point, Mark. And wow, as you talk about having more conversation, I'm so grateful that we've had a chance to have this conversation. I've learned a lot. It's given me a lot of food for thought on a variety of topics. I'm thinking now of my 20-year-old who's an environmental activist, and her attitudes as she expresses them about the way adults talk to 18, 19, 20-year-olds, even 15-year-olds on the environmental crisis we face, and I see the parallels. And I think you made a great finishing point there. So much to take from this conversation. I know it's going to be widely appreciated, and I appreciate it. And thank you very, very much, Mark Drumbl, law professor from Washington and Lee University, and co-author of a recent book and other writings as well on the whole subject of child soldiering around the world. Mark, again, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Have a nice, lovely day.